Substance use disorder is, I'll keep it simple, it's a brain disease. Um, and when you think of brain disease, you think of this idea of control. So, for anything that affects the brain, your control center for emotion, for thought processes, and for behavior, coincidentally, you think how much control do you have since your brain is basically the dictator in a lot of ways of human behavior. I kind of like to explain it in a way that would make sense to people. So, yeah, that's the definition, but let's get into what that really means, right? So, for for my way of helping people understand it, it's like how they say love is a drug. Well, there's actually been some interesting research done that suggests that love's effect on the brain is very similar to the effect of drugs like cocaine, opiates, opioids, any really pain reliever, its effect on the brain, and how the brain kind of reacts very similarly as it does to someone who is in love, as it does to someone who is also under the influence of cocaine or opiates or opioids. So I kind of put it out there like, how many people out there have been in love? I mean, like the deep, true kind of love, right? And it's like that feeling, when you have it, it's like, and that person's not with you, for instance, it's like, it like takes your soul away or something. It's like you don't even want to live anymore. There's a difference between not wanting to live and die, but not wanting to live anymore because the essence of why you exist is being ripped away from you. That's kind of the parallel between um, drugs' effects on the brain neuroanatomically and the effect that love has on the brain too. So I kind of like to ask the question to people like, okay, maybe you haven't been in love or whatever, but take a person or a place or a thing that you truly, truly enjoy, that brings you the most joy in your life, right? Think about that for a second. You got it? Okay, got it. Now, I'm going to tell you, okay, from this point on, you're not allowed to see that person. You're not allowed to spend time with that person. You're not allowed to go to that place that brings you so much satisfaction. And you're not allowed to do that thing that brings you so much joy. Because love and drugs alike hijack the pleasure center part of our brain, it's like you're ripping the best parts of their life away from them, neuroanatomically speaking, right? So when I kind of put it in that perspective, it gives people who haven't been in active addiction an idea of how hard that might be to go the rest of their life without spending time with their loved ones, or the rest of their life without seeing their pets, or the rest of their life without going to that family vacation spot, or the rest of their life, not doing that snowboarding activity or that wakeboarding activity that they've always loved to do. It's not as easy as it sounds. Addiction in my mind, right? So people can be addicted to shopping, people can be addicted to gambling, people can be addicted to sex. There are a lot of types of addictions, and the main thing that is in common with all of these addictions is that it really hijacks that pleasure center part of the brain to make you feel like you're you know, most loved, most belonged, most okay whenever you're in the act of addiction. So, are there differences? I'm sure people who have been through different types of addictions would say, "Oh, my addiction to alcohol is much different from your addiction to opiates or opioids." That exists. I've heard that in the rooms. I've heard that in groups. I've heard there'd be a lot of fragmented belief about that. But the truth is, when you boil it down to the main foundations of what is addiction, what does it look like, it's distressing. It affects the person's life and those around them who love them. It brings an element of danger. And I think, in a way, just like I said, it tends to isolate people or change their friend groups, change the places they hang around, change a lot of aspects of their lifestyle that they probably wouldn't have picked not having gone through the addiction.
Okay.
One of the big things is people assume that they had a choice, like somehow, some choice that they are a substance use disorder because they, at some point in their life, chose to do that, which is a misunderstanding. We consider addiction to be a brain disease, which acts differently with different people. But we all make choices. Our life is full of choices. People, for example, who go to college. College is notorious for people drinking particularly. And a lot of students might go to a party wanting to be with their friends, decide to drink. But at that point in time, they're not thinking about that, will making this choice result in my having a problem with alcohol. They just go along with their friends. Probably 90% of the people who drink, it won't create a problem. But there's that small group that it will eventually become a problem because of the way their brain responds to that substance. There's a lot of people who become addicted because inadvertently they have a medical procedure and their doctor prescribes a pain medication, and again the person's brain in such a way likes that experience and now causes them to think that they need to continue. The choice was simply because they were in pain at some time, they took it, but there was no thought that it could lead to an addiction. So people make that assumption that somehow all the bad things that are happening to them they deserve because they chose to be that way. But we're finding out that that's not. I've never met anybody who chose to be an alcoholic or a substance abuser.
Regarding addiction, the church has had different views and still has different views. Is it a disease? Is it a moral failure? What is substance use disorder? And ultimately, in some ways, maybe it doesn't matter as long as they are reaching out and trying to be helpful to help people recover from addiction. But I see it as not necessarily being either or. There is, I believe, a moral element to addiction when people engage in very self-destructive behaviors in their addiction. But I certainly understand addiction as a disease, that the drugs and the alcohol literally changes the brain and the way that the brain works, and it is a brain disease. So it's not an either or. Historically, though, the church has dealt with alcoholism and addiction as a moral failure, and that it's a matter of willpower, it's a matter of surrendering to God, and if you truly surrender to God, then you will be able to overcome the addiction and the disease, which has led to a lot, I think, of shame and guilt in people's lives as they fail over and over again. And so I think doing the approach that encompasses an understanding that it is both a physical, emotional, and spiritual aspect to the disease of addiction and alcoholism.
But for me, I always try to make it relatable to them. That's the key, right? If you can kind of apply it to something in their life that has meaning, then you might be able to switch that lens just a little bit. So for me, that's been the most successful way that I can actually break down barriers and stigma, is really related to something that they've gone through, something that they've experienced, something they can connect to more so than substance use disorder. Because let's face it, not all of us are addicted to substances, and not all of us had that experience. So the unknown, it's easy to, I think it's easier to judge the unknown in the unfamiliar. But when you really connect it to something that they've gone through, that they've experienced, now they can kind of at least gain a little bit more understanding and insight into what it really is like to go through a substance use disorder. Substance use is a brain disease. Is there an element of choice? There's an element in choice in a lot of things that we do, so I wouldn't discredit that there's some element of choice, at least initially. But like I said, when substance use gets its grip on you and has roots in your brain, strong roots in your brain, just as I described, as similar to like love, for instance, then it is really hard to get away from that kind of thing that makes you feel alive, that makes you feel numb when all you really feel for the most of the time is pain or suffering. So if you think about it, it's like, think about the worst stretch of your life, right? The worst stretch of your life. And when I think about my worst stretch of my life, I'm like, I probably wasn't the best person during that stretch of time. And I bet a lot of people who would watch this would probably agree and say, during the toughest point in their life, they weren't the best person they could be during that time either. Well, that's kind of what it's like, right? It's like people in addiction aren't bad people. People in addiction are going through a bad time. And when you go through a bad time, whether you're in addiction or whether you're not in addiction, it's hard, right? And you're not going to be your best person during that time. So I think that's where there's a lot of misconception and a lot of misunderstanding, because sometimes when we haven't been exactly through that person's life circumstances, the human side of us starts to get a little judgmental and say, they should have the willpower or the strength or, the control over their life to make things right. And I'm like, hey, I remember going through some things. It may not have been substance use, but it was hard to regain control of my life after enduring some of the things that I went to. And that's how I kind of relate to it a little bit more and see it more as partly choice but mostly a brain disease.
Well, there's a lot of stories in the Gospels of Jesus dealing with lepers. And so I've often saw that Jesus has worked with lepers who were considered the outcasts and the most broken. And Jesus' his view of the world is very much how a lot of people treat people with substance use disorders today. They're the outcasts, the people that we prefer to keep on the outside of the town limits. But just with leprosy, as we began to understand it as a disease and we came up with effective treatments for it, no one's bothered by lepers like they were in Jesus' time. But Jesus made a point that his ministry was with those people who were the most broken, the most displaced, the most alienated in society, because he knew that they would greatly appreciate the good news. And so when I hear these stories of recovery that people offer, you see a lot of the good news of what God can do in those situations.